Across several continents. It became the largest empire in history, controlling about a quarter of the world's land and population. During its centuries-long rule, the empire took precious resources and wealth from countries all over the world, including cultural and historical artifacts, many of which ended up here in the British Museum, which was founded in 1753 and kept growing to accommodate all the new pieces in its collection. Lots of the items in the museum were legally acquired and are completely undisputed, like this one, a 2,000-year-old Roman vase sold to the museum by a duke in 1945. The problem is with the pieces that are disputed, like the first item you see as soon as you walk in, the Rosetta Stone taken by British troops from the French in what is now Egypt. Or further in, the Parthenon sculptures, removed from the Acropolis in Athens by a British lord and sent to the British Museum. Or over here, on the floor dedicated to African art, the Benin bronzes, some of the most contentious items in the museum. The Benin bronzes are kind of hard to categorize because they include such a huge range of items, from engraved ivory tusks to brass sculptures to plaques.
Okay, hi everyone. And, the reason why I started off the class with this YouTube video is because this morning I was, before a few hours before class started, there was a Zoom seminar being organized by the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. And if I can find that here without wasting too much time, here you can see the announcement or the reminder of that session. And I guess there was 4 or 5 of these sessions. And so I watched the last one on this repatriation of items in the museums of Europe and the United States, consisting of items taken from colonial empire building, like the British Museum taking items from India and Africa, and as the theme in that YouTube video I was showing you, in the process by which this video series, this Zoom series, highlighting efforts to what they call decolonize universities, museums, libraries, because these museums and libraries were set up by the European colonialists that conquered these territories. And of course, the reason why, of course, it's a big topic for a number of reasons, including the fact that the peoples that are the legacies of these indigenous populations that lived in these areas, they often suffer marginalization, typically social marginalization in the United States among the indigenous population, or in Australia with the Aboriginal community, the people there that belong to different ethnic sovereign groups. Of course, also, and of course, Korea itself was a product of Japanese, was a victim of Japanese colonialism, and also many of the items that were in Korea over the thousands of years of history were then researched, studied by Japanese anthropologists, who then went into these Korean burial mounds where Korean kings of the ancient kingdoms of Shilla and Koguryo and Paekje were buried, and quote unquote excavated them and took back thousands of Korean items to Japan. And so Korea is very much part of this discussion as well these days about trying to get those items that were taken from royal tombs, burial mounds for Korean kings over many centuries, getting them back from Japan and to be brought back to Korea. So this is very much an ongoing discussion. And the reason how this is relevant to this course in European politics and society is because if you go further in studying, for example, the history of Japanese imperialism, and the creation of the modern Japanese state in the middle of the 19th century with the Meiji Restoration, that the Japanese were looking to adopt what we call today in the early 21st century or late 20th century best practice. The best practice, which countries and states were the models, the avatars for the most effective, successful, most modern, to use today's language, the most modern forms of state behavior and policy at the time. And of course, and in the 19th century, the late 19th century, it was the British Empire. The British Empire. So this is also very relevant to you international students who are studying here at the Catholic University of Korea. You've probably been on the subway, on the Korea's beautiful, Seoul's beautiful subway system, and gone through City Hall Station, and you can see City Hall and other buildings down there are built in this British style, in this British Victorian architectural style. And that's because they were first founded by the Japanese imperialists. When the Japanese occupied Korea, they decided to do their modeling or their vision of urban renewal, and they wanted to pay homage to and give respect to the other great power of the world at the time, the British Empire. So you go look at the City Hall building in Seoul, and it looks British because it was built by the Japanese, because the Japanese, like much of the world, looked to the British Empire as the leading power in the world community, the practicer of best practices. And so these Japanese anthropologists and social scientists surely were saying, well, the British are taking items from their empire and bringing them back to London to put in the British Museum. We should do the same in our empire. And so much of the items that were looted from Korean monuments ended up in Japan, and Korea's trying to get them back. And in terms of how, again, relevant to this class, because, you know, if I were to teach the class on, and I think you were in the class for American foreign policy. Yeah. So we talked about Hans Morgenthau, and Hans Morgenthau was this founder of the paradigmatic theory of international relations called realism. And Hans Morgenthau founded what we call classical realism today. And Hans Morgenthau made the point that it is, or he illustrated and illuminated and explored the tendency of the leaders of states to justify their foreign policies of their state, which is a product, of course, of a very complex, sloppy, political foreign policymaking process, right? What Bismarck called, you know, what did Bismarck talk about policymaking? He says, people might like the output of government policy, you know, in terms of policy, but they don't like to see what goes into the making of it. It's like sausage. We love sausage, sausage. But do you know what goes into making sausage? It's pretty ugly. And that's true about policy making, including foreign policy making. So nevertheless, this complicated, sloppy political process of making foreign policy with these different groups struggling with each other to influence the policy directions of the government, and the government trying to balance and reconcile them, and to make the political pressures less or go away, will nevertheless have to justify this policy output in broadly appealing ideological or religious symbols. In broadly appealing ideological religious symbols. And so the British Empire claimed it, and you have also great writers and artists explaining this process and justifying it because they're proud patriots of often, particularly during the Romantic period of their nations. And would come to mind is Rudyard Kipling, the great poet of British imperialism. He described the expansion of the British Empire and the role of the British Empire as the white man's burden. It's the burden of the white man to bring civilization to the non-white races of the world. The burden of the white man. That the British Empire or the French Empire are bringing civilization to Africa and Asia. What's the French term? Mission civilisatrice? The civilizing mission of the French Empire. I don't know French. Okay, and of course the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That's 19th century, but in the 20th century, we have terms like the Bolshevik Communist Revolution, expanding Russian influence in the world, and not saying, well, we're trying to create a new form of the Russian Empire. No, we're communists trying to advance the world's socialist dialectic. We're not expanding Russian domination. No, no, no. What we're doing is good for us, and it's good for you, because socialism is better than capitalism. Capitalism is exploitative. Capitalism causes wars and imperialism and racism. So by expanding the influence and control of Moscow in the world in the 20th century, we're expanding the influence of socialism and bringing about a world of a better future for you and me and everybody in the whole planet. When, of course, that's Hans Morgenthal's argument, like we've talked about in this class. He had a big influence, he reflected this big influence of the early psychologists or psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud, and others in generations after him also used these notions about, for example, what we call motivated reasoning, or psychological balancing that we've talked about in this class. How I want to see a world around me in a way that makes me feel good or allows me to feel good about doing what it is I want to do, which means expand my influence. And so if I can convince you that me expanding my influence is good for you, not just for me, then you're less likely to resist me. And it costs me less to try to expand my influence. And so nations do this as well. And Hans Morgenthau called this nationalistic universalism. So the Soviets talked about advancing the dialectic. Napoleon, when he was conquering Europe over 200 years ago, was not conquering Europe to create a new French empire. No, no, no. He was conquering Europe to expand, to spread fraternity, brotherhood, equality, and liberté, equality, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, and brotherhood. Yay! Who can be against freedom, liberty, and equality? Or even Adolf Hitler. Is he trying to create a German imperial empire that would be under his domination? Sure, but he still tried to justify it, and the Nazis tried to justify it about fighting godless Bolshevism, fighting those communists. Oh, we have to fight the communists. We have to conquer Eastern Europe because we have to fight and defend the world and Europe and the world from communism. And also because we want to establish a 1,000-year Aryan Reich, a white Reich, led by Germany and Hitler. And this is the point I want to get to, that it seems to me when you look at history, and of course, let's not forget to pick on the Americans, right? That the Americans also, they have their modernization theory, right? They're invading Afghanistan and they're invading Iraq in order to modernize those countries and bring development and modernity and democracy to them. Against their barbaric terrorist rulers who want to oppress women and so on. And so, but to go back to the Hitler case, my point I'm trying to make is that when Hitler was coming to power in the 1930s in interwar crisis Europe, he was, of course, also, and his movement were very much Europeans in that sense, that they're trying to appeal to the rest of Europe, that we are the epitome of what Europe stands for. To be a European at the end of the 19th century is to have an empire. You're cool if you have an empire. Like the British have an empire, even we, Spain and Portugal have empires. We Germans and we Italians and we Japanese want empires, because that's what a great power does. You have an empire. And Germany is doing, their empire is not good just for Germany, it's good for the whole white race, because of course this notion, modern notions of race emerged along with the European expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries into Africa, into the New World. Modern notions of race emerged at those times, that there's a white European race and that there are black races. And these are all subjective notions, but they're very much tied up with colonialism. Colonialism in early capitalism. And then to jump ahead a few hundred years, when Hitler's coming to power and trying to justify his expansionist imperialist policies, he's trying to justify it in terms of creating a white domination of the world. And of course, he and his ideologues had difficulty deciding who was white or not. Rosenberg was his main theorist on this regard, and he had trouble figuring out, some Slavs were more white than others. Like evidently, Ukrainians were closer to Germans than Polish people. Polish people, which of course are right next door to the Germans, they're Untermenschen. But Ukrainian Slavs, they're better. They're better. And it's not coincidentally that some of these intense Ukrainian nationalists who constituted the most effective fighting force in the Ukrainian army today, the Azov Battalion, they remember Hitler's support for them against their enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, remember? The Soviet Union and Moscow during World War II. And so, in a sense, what I'm saying is that Nazism and racism under Nazism was the essential acceleration of these trends that began many generations earlier, that as the Germans are trying to express and articulate their justification for what they're trying to do for Germany and for the world. An Aryan empire dominated by the Aryans, and they decide who's an Aryan or not. And again, building upon these legacies of imperialism. And these legacies of imperialism are reflected in museums. They're reflected in mindsets, and they're reflected not just in museums, they're also reflected in our thinking. Like, what is considered a modern civilized person? I guess this is a course on Europe, so I'm not going to talk too much about the United States, right? But the colonizer's culture. So what is the core culture of Israel? It's the European Jews who established Israel, the Ashkenazi. People like Ariel Sharon, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, European Jews, right? Ashkenazi Jews. And so you still have settler colonialism at work, European settler colonialism in the case of, for example, of the Zionist project. And in South Africa, which only until 1994, only in 1994 did finally the white core dominant minority group in that state acquiesce to democratization. But of course, the socioeconomic trends still have the wealth concentrated in the white population, even though over 70% of the population is not white. These legacies of what it means to be European and therefore modern and therefore enlightened and therefore civilized are still, the claim is that these are institutionalized everywhere in our public policies, in our implicit normative assumptions, even what it means to be beautiful. What's the most beautiful American? A white European, preferably blonde, blue-eyed American. Oh, right? And everybody who cannot meet that standard is considered not unattractive in these stereotypes. These are stereotypes, but they're also reflected institutionally in formal institutions in the form of these museums that were created, like the British Museum 250 years ago, right? In 1762, I think, the British Museum was created. and what was the theme on this Zoom session this morning was, for example, how the Habsburg Empire, which controlled much of what we call North and South America today, is under pressure in their museum in Vienna, the old capital of the Habsburg Empire, to repatriate items that were taken as loot by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and later by other Europeans, the French in Africa, or the Germans when they got to Africa. The effort to push the Germans to give back the Benin bronzes. This is a Benin bronze from the Kingdom of Benin in Africa. I think that ended up in the German museum somewhere. And so there's this pressure to get the German museums to give these back to the new museum in Benin, in what was the Kingdom of Benin in Africa. I think it's not called Benin anymore. And that's a lot in the news these days. And so is this, which, well, actually didn't know this. This is the headdress or crown of Moctezuma, the leader of the Aztec Empire when the Spanish conquistadors arrived. And of course, the Spanish conquistadors were part of the Habsburg Empire at the time. And so Montezuma's headdress or crown made out of feathers is in this Vienna museum, and is attempting to oh, yeah, I forgot when you do that. Yeah, oh, there it is. It does come up this time. Okay, so there you can see this big push to try to get the. It's in the Museum of Ethnology. Yeah, you know, that's the name of the name of this museum. To give it back to, I guess, to Mexico. And it says a modern reproduction, and so and of course. These legacies of imperialism is a legacy that also affects Europe, not just the rest of the world, but also Europe, because of course Europe, when it was at its height of power, it had empires. But building empires in the old way is not very effective, because with the mobilization of public awareness through the spreading awareness of political change as a reality of human existence that human beings themselves can control, we see the rise of nationalism. Nationalisms that defeat the United States in Vietnam, what we call nationalism. I'm not talking about an ideology of nationalism. I'm talking about nationalistic mobilization to defend your perceived in-group, or to defeat the Soviet Union and later the United States and Afghanistan, to cause the breakup of empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish and Portuguese, and then the Russian Empire. And now with Russia being a nation state, it's just good old-fashioned Russian irredentism, that Ukraine is something we created, and they're not going to be allowed to brainwash and assimilate our people and make them into Ukrainians, because it's just humiliating. It is humiliating for these people that were stereotyped as backward, silly peasants, Ukrainci, frontiersmen. That's what it means in English, frontiersmen. That they're going to get their own state, and they're going to claim our history, and they're going to brainwash our people, and they're going to take away our cradle, where we supposedly were created as a Russian entity 1,000 years ago when we accepted Christianity with Kiev as the lead city. No! And and of course, this legacy of imperialism continues, as I said, in many, many infinite ways, in terms of the implicit assumption about aesthetic beauty, aesthetic attractiveness, about how you speak correctly. Like if you speak with an accent in the wrong way, you're considered a country bumpkin. You have to speak in the perfect way. You can't speak in black English. You can't speak with a Serbian dialect of Bulgarian. In Bulgaria, people laugh at you. Oh, you're an uneducated peasant. Or you're a, well, anyway, I don't want to go too far on those stereotypes. But and so this is the ideology, the theoretical framing for understanding these legacies, including how they're institutionalized in bureaucracies, economic and public, private and public, is called settler colonialism. And so this is, if you're interested in, this is how, the point I want to add here is that people, again, have a tendency, as understood by Freud and Morgenthau, to want to see the world in a way that allows them to feel good about doing whatever it is they want to do. And they come up with justifications and explanations. And they make those justifications and explanations into laws. And they use those laws as proof of the legitimacy of their justification, because people tend to assume what is legal is right, that what exists is good, and somebody wants to change it, automatically is viewed with suspicion. And this is Europe, because the settler colonialists were Europeans, at least in the modern era. Although this website does talk about Chinese settler colonialism having its manifestation and how the Chinese view these peoples backward. So they're doing a service to the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. They're civilizing them. They're uplifting them by making them go to education camps and learn trades and stop practicing that silly, foolish mythology of God, of this big sky fairy in the sky called Allah. And of course, becoming radical and dangerous. We're civilizing by basically making them into Chinese. So it's not just, it's everybody has this tendency, or the Russians expanding outward into this area, all the way out to Northern California at one point. And of course, in terms of how this relates directly to this class, well, this is very much, of course, a European thing, because the Europeans did all of their work here, right? And then also, they also annexed so much of this territory and left a legacy there. But in terms of other interesting aspects of this, speaking as an American and as therefore a descendant of a European settler colonial project, you know, one of the interesting examples that I like to use to highlight this role of seeing the world in a self-serving manner. Remember, people do not want to feel pain. I want to feel good about who I am and what I like. And so I will see the world, including the past, because reality includes the past, in a way that is self-serving. So this is an interesting case, and it's relevant for this class, because this class is about European politics and society, is the Hispanic American community in the United States, predominantly Mexican heritage. And the big implicit holiday for Hispanic Americans in the United States that emerged, say, about 30 or 40 years ago, was Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May. And this 5th of May in Spanish commemorates the Battle of Puebla, in which this is 1862, when the Americans are in civil war between North and South. And the Mexican government had fallen behind on its debt payments to European powers, including the French banking interests that had loaned money to Mexico. So when the United States is preoccupied with the Civil War, Napoleon III, Emperor of France, the great grandnephew of the great Napoleon, he decides he's going to take advantage of this opportunity, expand the French Empire, the Second French Empire, into Mexico. And they invade Mexico, and they look around, and they need to put a prince in power. They send the French army into Mexico to try to put their own client government in power in Mexico City, while America's preoccupied with the Civil War, because the Americans don't want anybody messing around that area. They want it for themselves. But they're preoccupied fighting the South in the Civil War. So they send their army in, and they're defeated. The French army is actually defeated at the Battle of Puebla. I mean, here you have an indigenous post-colonial society defeating one of the great European powers. And this supposedly happened on the 5th of May. And the reason I mention this is because this is the big holiday in the United States today for Hispanic American heritage, on the 5th of May, which was today's the 20th, so it was 15 days ago, a little over 2 weeks ago. And so if you go to the United States and you go to the restaurants and the bars, people they're drinking lots of Dos Equis beer, and what's the other Mexican beer that Americans like? Corona, the Corona beer, and they have Mexican American food, and it's celebrated. Even though this is not a national holiday in Spain, in Mexico, it's not Mexico's Independence Day. It's at most a regional holiday. It's not Mexico's Independence Day, but it is celebrated because it's a holiday in which Mexican Americans can love both Mexico and the United States, because they can point to this battle, the Battle of Puebla, as being critical when America, let's get romantic here in terms of our imagery. America is in its civil war, brother against brother, father against son, families torn apart in this horrible bloodthirsty battle. And then the evil French emperor decides, ha, 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 I will now take advantage of the opportunity to rebuild our European empire and by expanding it into Mexico. Ha, 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 ha. And while this terrible tragedy is going on in America and the United States, the Mexicans defeat Napoleon III at this battle, and thereby help save America at its time of crisis. That this battle was somehow essentially a part of the creation of modern United States. And the French then sent in more troops, and they eventually won. And they installed Maximilian I as Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian of the Habsburg dynasty in Vienna. One of the uncles of Franz Joseph, the last emperor of Austria, because Louis Napoleon needs to put an aristocrat in power in his Mexican kingdom that he wants to create there, his Mexican Klein state, and he needs to find some boy in one of the ruling houses of Europe, the Habsburg or the Hohenzollern or the whomever, and he puts him in power. But to make sure that this is fully told, this holiday is not, as I said, it's not Mexico's Independence Day. It's not even a national holiday. It's a regional holiday. And it was even despised because this person was the dictator of Mexico for 40 years. And it was and he claimed or legitimated his dictatorship in Mexico by claiming that he was one of these officers who fought at the Battle of Puebla, Porfirio Diaz. And he established a de facto dictatorship that ruled from 1876 to 1911, and produced a brutal and corrupt dictatorship that led to the Mexican Civil War when he was no longer in power, and that the Mexican Civil War killed at least 10% of the population in Mexico. And so he claimed his legitimacy because he claimed he fought in that war, in that Battle of Puebla. And then the French intervention in Mexico. So and then of course eventually the Americans defeat the South. And as in the case of all imperialisms, the French say this is too expensive. We can continue to control this area if we want to, or we can try, but it costs too much money. And we need the money for other things, like building up our European army to deal with rising Germany, the rising Prussian threat that wants to unify Germany under Prussian kingdom. And so they withdraw their forces, the French withdraw their forces, and I don't know the full story of what happened, but Maximilian II ends up getting overthrown. The French decide they can't support him anymore, and there's the Second French Empire, and under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and let me see if I can find the. Back to the Battle of Puebla, and then I have it here. Sorry. I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay, just a second. Lost it. And the Habsburg prince that is made Emperor of Mexico, and he is overthrown and he's executed. And his execution becomes a focus. There you see his dead body being displayed after he's executed. And I thought I had there's a famous painting that was made by, I think, Monet. That is one of the earliest impressionist paintings. And, oh well, I have it here, but I, cables, too many cables. Oh, well, I can't find it right now, but I thought I had it ready to go, but I don't see it here. Am I spelling it wrong? I think, yeah, maybe I'm spelling it wrong. This is the execution. Yeah, there it is. Okay, there's the painting. And there you see, he looked like he's being executed by French troops, but there's the Emperor Maximilian trying to show that he's a great Mexican patriot wearing a sombrero, and his two generals or field marshals being executed alongside him. And this is supposedly one of the founding paintings of what became Impressionism. And so, again, this legacy of imperialism shaping so much of what it means to be a modern European in terms of their fundamental assumptions and thinkings about what it means to be a great European. And of course, it's still relevant today because, of course, the British, unlike the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese in their efforts to build their empire, the British Empire, they believe, was never defeated. The British Empire was a glorious history, part of their history that they don't have to be ashamed of, although of course they do have to be ashamed of it because they don't know or they don't want to know all the bad things that the British did, for example, in India during the 20th century. But the British very much are still very much associated that their British Empire was a glorious time in the world, a time that saved the world because they were the only great power left standing against Hitler's Germany until Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union. Britain was technically at war Great Britain was technically at war with Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union was neutral until Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union to build Lebensraum, to establish an Aryan empire over those lesser human Slavs that occupied the territory. And so, all right, so again, to show you how these topics are still really important and interesting today for understanding European politics and European social movements. In terms of, for example, returning these artifacts that are in the British Museum, the German museums, the Austrian museums back to their places where they were looted from. And it's not just a European issue, it's also an issue for Chinese and Koreans that were subjects of British and Japanese imperialism. Again, but for other cases, and particularly in the case of, I guess to some extent also for Korea, but particularly in these places like United States and Asia, and Australia and Africa, that these marginalized communities are still under the cultural domination of the settlers from Europe that settled there, and they're viewed and stereotyped as backward, as inferior, as lazy, as dumb, as worthless, including their culture, their looks, as for example reflected in the use in America of their images for mascots. Until last year, the professional baseball team in Cleveland was the Cleveland Indians, and under pressure, the Cleveland Indian Major League Baseball team changed its name and started this year as the Cleveland Guardians, because the issue of the Cleveland Indian baseball team was considered to be, the mascot was considered to be a foolish individual like Chief Wahoo. This was the old mascot of the Cleveland Indians baseball team. And so you can see that's no longer allowed. It's considered to be a slur against Indian Americans, indigenous people, with the big smile, red, or the, again, reflecting that these people are stereotyped as not really human beings. They're a joke at best, or at worst, a pestilence, like vermin, like rats. And of course, also, yes, the San Francisco Redskins, Washington Redskins was the old mascot for the Washington, D.C. football team, American football team. That has been changed. There you see, they tried to, well, now it's the Commanders. They changed the name to the Commanders. And they're not showing what the old mascot looks like. Yeah, there you can see the Indian head that was on their old, well, until last year, well, until a couple of years ago. They officially became the Commanders now, just now. And of course, so that's the reason we're concerned about it, because these people, I mean, typically, there's not just because they feel embarrassed. On American Indian reservations, the life expectancy in Pine Bluff Indian Reservation in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, around that area, is about the same as it is in Somalia. The life expectancy of men, Indian men on those Indian reservations in America, is about the same as it is in Somalia, you know, where there's horrible poverty and fighting, and they die from alcoholism, diabetes, from being overweight, drug overdose, methamphetamines, because that reflects the generations upon generations of the marginalization of these people, of the dispossession, of trauma, of years and generations of trauma upon trauma being passed down to the children in the family. And this is true in India, in Canada, it's true in Australia. I mean, I was in Australia 5 or 6 years ago for a conference in Darwin, and you see lots of Aboriginal people walking around, and they don't look in great shape. And they get in fights. I could hear them fighting outside with each other, you know, trying to get alcohol from the store, high levels of alcoholism, drug abuse. And so this effort to try to allow them to feel good about themselves, encourage them to feel, because you're not going to improve in your life unless you respect yourself. I'm not going to respect you if I'm a white American unless you respect yourself. But if you really think, you're right, I am a backward imperialist, silly, ugly, stupid thing, you're not going to go anywhere until you have self-respect. And that's true for Black people, Hispanic people, women, gays, people that have been traditionally viewed as Untermenschen in the Nazi framework. It's disgusting. We would do a favor getting rid of them all. And so that's why this topic about museums, because museums, they receive government funding. They're places where you take school children to go be educated, whether it be Bulgarian schools. I remember right before I left Bulgaria, I went to a Bulgarian museum, and they were still using the same museum displays and scripts that the museum guides were using under communism. So you go to a Bulgarian museum, and it's museum day for the school children to come to the museum and see the museum. And so they come and they go to the museum that shows Bulgaria's history, and you see on the wall a picture, big mural of Bulgarian peasants in black and white, all with the face in a frown like this, being dominated and controlled by the evil Turks under the Ottoman Ropstval, the Turkish yoke, the Turkish enslavement. Oh, look at that, 500 years. The Muslim Turks, they abused us and exploited us and raped our women and raped our boys because they like to have sex with men. And oh my God, 500 years we went through this, oh my God. And they're still using the same scripts that they had in 2008 that they had from communism. So it would be nice for me to go back and see, have they finally gotten around to changing their museum displays and policies? Because that is a focus in European cultural policy. Like, if you notice, Europeans in the European Union are committed that there is an exchange of museum directors, like the chief director of prominent museum in Germany should not be German, should be a French director or an English director, on purpose, because they know what they're talking about, right? And so, and just to conclude, as Karl Marx said in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, he was commenting upon Louis Napoleon and that, he was a joke. Louis Napoleon, the coup of, yeah, so this is the discussion of his coup to make himself emperor of the French. And, but Karl Marx wrote, yeah, this is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon that Karl Marx wrote and described this guy. He was a clown, Louis Napoleon. He's claiming he's like his great grand uncle. And he does things like try to create a French client state in Mexico and gets destroyed. And then he goes to war with Germany, and Otto von Bismarck and the Prussians defeat France in the Franco-Prussian War after 3 weeks and occupy Paris. This is the great emperor of the French. And Marx had a great quote from that book that history is experienced first as tragedy and then repeats itself as farce. And we're seeing this kind of farce element reemerge today with, again, the rise of white power supremacy in America, in Europe. Even Vladimir Putin is talking about traditional Aryan white, he doesn't use the term Aryan because that's too closely associated with the Nazis. But he's still talking in those terms about, the superior European white race in relation to the Muslims and the non-white peoples. So, yeah, this quote from the book. Yeah, that history repeats itself as tragedy and then as farce. So let's do it again. Let's play with Nazi Aryan supremacy again and see where that gets us. And so, all right. So back to the notes, and all right. So we were talking about Europeanization, and another point I want to make in this class that's really kind of important is that the book is outdated. The book was published in 2020, so it's the most recent textbook available. It's from Oxford University Press. It's a good book, right? But the book was finished probably at the end of 2019, and then went to the publishers in 2020 and came out in 2020, and I ordered a copy of it and started using it. There's nothing else more recent. So everything that's happened since the pandemic is not covered in that book. And what's happened in the pandemic is really quite astounding in terms of Europeanization of the member states, however we define what Europeanization is about. For example, the European Union is responding to the pandemic, and it's also responding to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And see here is a news report about what the here, make sure you can see that. This is from 2 days ago. European Union unveils $220 billion plan to ditch Russian energy, using much of the money that was not yet spent from the Next Generation EU Pandemic Recovery Funds, they are also adopting programs to shift Europe, further accelerate the move away from oil and gas, fossil fuels, using the war with Russia, Ukraine's war with Russia, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as the justification and political support for this acceleration of this program. That's going to cost money, and it's going to be, and it's going to cause many vested interests to be upset about this shift, using the claim of threat to Europe in the form of Moscow under Putin as the justification for this. And unfortunately, or fortunately, or just that's the way human beings are, it's easier to get organized if you have a common enemy. Even if that means making one up. Looking for an enemy, because you know it's easier to do things if the enemy of my enemy is my friend. My colleague becomes my friend. We're able to cooperate more easily. So it says here, the European Commission, and again, this is not your textbook, right? The European Commission has announced a 210 billion euro plan to end its dependency on Russian fossil fuels. The European Union gets at least, 40% of its energy from Russia in terms of oil and gas, and to transition to green energy. The move comes as the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Europe's top gas suppliers prompted the EU to rethink its energy policies with sharper concerns of supply shocks. And so it goes on here that you see of course, these politicians, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announces the package. It says that Moscow supplies 40% of the bloc's natural gas and 27% of its imported oil. And they're all supposed to stop importing Russian coal. Again, its impact on the world is not really clear because India is taking full advantage. Poor, desperately developing India, trying to deal with China and climate change, needs to develop fast. They're buying as much discounted Russian oil and gas, oil and coal as they can because they need to. And so Russia doesn't have any problem so far finding somebody to buy its oil and gas and coal if the Europeans are going to reduce their purchasing of it. So it goes on in this report to note that the measures include a mix of EU laws, 9 binding schemes, and recommendations that governments in the EU's 27 member countries who are largely in charge of their national energy policy. So they haven't delegated yet oversight of this. Well, you would imply that if they're going to allocate European Union money, that would mean that the European Commission is going to become more important in overseeing and monitoring what the 27 member states are doing. So again, this shift towards federalism, de facto federalism, where the European Commission is going to say, well, okay, so Poland, you're supposed to get 10 billion euros to move away from coal, but you have to do certain things. Have you done them? Oh, you haven't done them. Well, you don't get the money until you do them. And that's federalism. That's what the US government does with regard to the states. The US government engages in partnership agreements with the American 50 states. For example, Mississippi wants more money from the US government to build more roads. The US government says, okay, Mississippi, you put up 10% of the cost, and we'll give you another $20 billion, but you have to do what we want you to do, including making sure that the people that work and build those roads are from companies that are diverse and have Black people working for them and Hispanic people working for them. And you have to meet environmental standards that the United States is setting. You don't have to do it, Mississippi. You don't have to do it, Ohio. You don't have to do it, Texas. But if you want all this money, you have to do it. And they usually say yes. Almost always they say yes. That's what the European Commission is doing now since the book was published that we're using in this class. And that is a first. This is all in the last 2 years. Taken together, Brussels expects them to require 210 billion euros in extra investments by 2027, 300 billion euros by 2030 on top of what's already needed to meet the bloc's 2030 climate target. So there's nothing in this report about how the European Commission is going to monitor this, but that's typically what happens. I mean, somebody has to agree that, yes, Poland is doing, or Bulgaria is doing what they agreed to do, to get the money from the rest of the European Union. And it's called Repower EU. That's the name of this program, adopted just a couple days ago. Repower EU. And it gives you a description of the investments. Brussels wants countries to finance the measures. Brussels, the place where the headquarters of the European Union is, wants countries to finance the measures using the EU's COVID-19 recovery fund, which contains more than 200 billion euros of unspent loans. So the European Union, under European Recovery Program, as part of Next Generation EU, allocated 800 billion euros. 200 billion of that euros has not yet been allocated and spent. So they're saying, well, let's use that now for green energy. Let's increase our commitment to green energy. And so again, the commission will also sell extra carbon market permits from a reserve over the next few years to raise 20 billion euros. That's again, oh my God, this is federalism. This is 21st century federalism. The European Commission is going to raise money through issuing more carbon permits. Some analysts warned that could dampen carbon prices. Okay, let's just go on here. And so this is from Al Jazeera. But I highlighted the report from Al Jazeera because it showed this emphasis that up until the present, European energy policies are national energy policies. So that's where you start, but you use these incentives. If the European Union, using money that is raised at the effort and cost and efforts of all of Europe, is going to give money to Czech Republic or Bulgaria or Poland or Portugal, they have to be evaluated in terms of what they're doing in their plans and their implementation of those plans in order to keep getting the money that is promised to them under Next Generation EU or Repower EU. And that is federalism. And then here's the, of course, everybody's got a beautiful website, and of course, this is the European Union's website. And why is it being so kind of? So this is the press release from a couple days ago from the European Commission. Facts to all the news services and media so that they can report on this. Well, not necessarily fax. We don't fax much anymore. They might still fax, but I'm sure they send it to everybody's inbox, email inbox. And this is the press release about the Repower EU program, and earlier. Well, I talked about Next Generation EU. Yeah. So here is, for example, and this is from just 9 days ago. The European Commission has today issued a further 9 billion euros in a dual tranche transaction under the Next Generation EU recovery instrument recovery from the pandemic. The deal is the 9th syndicated transaction under Next Generation EU in the 4th of 2022. That began 11 months ago, the first tranche. It consists of a new 3-year bond of 6 billion euros due on 4th of July 2025 and a $3 billion tap of an existing 30-year bond due on 6 July 2051. It doesn't say how much interest they're offering. They're going to, what kind of profit you're going to get. This is the first 3-year bond the Commission has issued under its diversified funding strategy. With its sale, the Commission has now established its issuances across the full spectrum of long-term bond maturities from 33 to 30 years. The transactions attracted very strong interest by investors. Thank you, Germany. Thank you, Mario Draghi and your big bazooka. The 30-year bond, thank you, Economic and Monetary Union, and Germany and Draghi convincing the world that, yes, this really is an economic and monetary union. And the 30-year bond was over 16 times oversubscribed with bids exceeding 48 billion euros, thus becoming the most oversubscribed Next Generation EU transaction to date. In other words, it's considered to be safe investment. It will be repaid. In other words, Germany. Germany must make this European thing work. Europeanization must work. Germany needs this. and Germany will do whatever it takes to make it work. The Commission will continue using the funds raised to support Europe's recovery and resilience, financing member states under recovery and resilience facilities, as well as under other programs. So what else do I want to highlight here? Yeah, it goes on here that each of the member states of the European Union has to submit a plan to the European Commission as to how they're going to spend this next generation money, right? Each country, and then the European Commission looks at the plan and says, okay, you got it. Oh, Poland. You know, we don't know Poland. Why are you letting your local governments ban same-sex marriage? Why are you trying to undermine the independence of your judges? I'm sorry, Poland. We're not going to give you your $36 billion euros under this next generation program until you fulfill your European obligations. And that's what they've been saying. And there was a deadlock and a stalemate between Poland and the European Commission until yesterday. Oh, did I forget to mention that Russia invaded Ukraine 2 months ago? No, I didn't forget. Next generation EU is a temporary instrument bringing up to 800 billion euros in support of Europe's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, building a greener, more digital, and more resilient Europe. To finance the next generation EU, the Commission will borrow up to around 800 billion euros in current prices on capital markets by the end of 2026. There's no indication that that's going to happen in your text. Of this total, up to 723.8 billion will be made available under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and an additional 83.1 billion will support key programs. And yeah, so they describe how the European Commission is selling bonds on the market and people are snapping them up. And voila, when Russia invades Ukraine, the United States, the mighty benign hegemon, the United States, the benign hegemon, as many political scientists have described American hegemony, which classical realists like Hans Morgenthau would say, all imperial powers claim that their hegemony is benign, whether it's Moscow or Japan or Paris, whether it's Napoleon, whether it's Louis XIV, they all claim that they're trying to bring goodness to the world through expanding. Of course, the Americans, but no, American hegemony is different. It's based upon liberalism. It's political and economic liberal hegemony. And so it's a different kind of hegemony. How can you compare American hegemony with Hitlerian Berlin hegemony or Stalin's Moscow hegemony? Come on. But the benign hegemon has been elected Joe Biden as president. And you can see there's been talks about the developed countries of the world, so-called developed countries, trying to come up with a common corporate taxation system so that companies like Apple and Alphabet, Google, and Microsoft don't run away to another country and make up a headquarters there on paper in order to get the lower taxation rates. And so I won't go through it all. Of course, it's the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, who's Barack Obama's Federal Reserve chairperson. Now it's Jay Powell. She's Treasury Secretary under Joe Biden. She arrived in Europe this week to join U.S. allies in confronting multiple threats to the world economy, Russia's war in Ukraine, soaring inflation, and food shortages. So I won't go through the whole, but she goes to Warsaw. In meetings in Warsaw on Monday under the Law and Justice Party, Ms. Yellen pressed top Polish officials to let the process move ahead, making clear that the tax deal continues to be a priority of the United States. She met with Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki and Finance Minister Magdalena Rzeczkowska. So, you know, these poorer countries like traditionally Ireland and other countries have wanted to try to get more investment in their countries by having lower taxation rates. I mean, that's what Ireland did. That's how Ireland became the Celtic tiger, copying the Asian tigers of South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong and Singapore, not copying them, but we talked about Ireland in the 1980s being the Celtic tiger, growing at a fast rate because their taxation rates are incredibly low. And that's how they got, for example, I think it's Apple, to set up a fake headquarters in Ireland so that they didn't have to pay US taxation rates, because they said, well, our headquarters is in Ireland. And, but just to highlight here, the European Union has refused to disperse billions in aid in Poland since late last year, citing separate concerns over Warsaw's interference with the independence of its judicial system. Last week, on the eve of Ms. Yellen's visit to Poland, the European Commission came up with an 11th hour deal unlocking 36 billion euros in pandemic recovery funds for Poland, which pledges to meet certain milestones, such as judiciary and economic reforms, in return for the money. Yay! I don't mean to be cynical, but that's Homo sapiens. And so this is the real substance of Europeanization. And all joking aside, of course, considering that, since Switzerland, like, is Switzerland part of Europe? Anais, do you feel European? Oh, she does. That's right. Don't think about it too much. Anais is European, even though Switzerland is not in the European Union. So this should open up, unless there's a problem here. Here, this is from last year, just to show you what it's like to be integrated into the European economic sphere, but not in the European Union. This report highlights, and I haven't checked up on it in a year since I first saw this, that Switzerland and the European Union have to agree and negotiate each separate area under a treaty agreement. It says here that Switzerland has walked out of talks on a closer trading relationship with the European Union despite being offered better terms in the United Kingdom in key areas. Switzerland, while outside the EU, is the bloc's fourth biggest trading partner, and its economy is closely integrated with 27 member states. Okay, citizens of Switzerland and the EU member states have a mutual right to free movement of labor across borders, but the Swiss government could not accept the Swiss government claimed it could not accept the EU's demands to maintain and deepen ties, as they would be rejecting a legally required referendum on a deal. The two sides have been in talks for 7 years over a new framework that would overtake the 100 plus bilateral treaties that govern Swiss access to the single European market, but which risk becoming outdated and hampering trade. The negotiation collapsed due to Switzerland's rejection of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and a free movement directive that would offer permanent residence to EU citizens, with access to Social Security granted to non-employed residents such as job seekers and students. The European Commission has responded publicly by warning of a risk to the privileged access enjoyed by Switzerland to its markets. Behind the scenes, EU officials said they were not hugely surprised by the decision from Bern, claiming that while Brussels had offered to commit 2 or 3 days a week to talks, the Swiss came every fortnight to discuss things, so every 14 days. So I guess they're claiming the Swiss were not too enthused about this, about these negotiations. So on Thursday, Cassis, whoever that is, said parts of the Swiss economy would need to prepare for disruption due to the risk of barriers to trade emerging as bilateral agreements failed to keep up with developments. Of immediate consequences, the expiration yesterday of regulatory permissions allowing Swiss certified medical devices to be sold in the European Union. So, I mean, that's the point that I was bringing up. Like, we're looking to what kind of relationship would the United Kingdom have with the European Union after Brexit? Well, let's look at the United Kingdom's, let's look at Great Britain. Let's look at Switzerland's relationship with the European Union. What can we learn from that? Well, here's an article highlighting what that relationship is like between Switzerland and the European Union. And there's a lot of negotiating, a lot of bilateral negotiation, 100 plus bilateral treaties that each have to be renegotiated between Switzerland and the European Union, because Switzerland is not in the European Union. So I haven't checked about what's happened since then. It wouldn't be hard to do that, do some keyword searches in the news. So let's see what kind of to do the smart attendance. So let's do that. And we go to attendance. We go to week 12. I thought I would, oh, okay, week 12, smart attendance. And your number is 206. 206 is your smart attendance number.